Let's talk.
John Brown.
Every now and again, I get a guest on my show, and we have such a great conversation that I say to my producer, I have got to get this guy back on again to talk about other stuff. Because last time I had Martyn Whittock on the show, we talked about Vikings in the East. We went down so many labyrinthine corridors and canals and riverways, and we ended up with Harold Hardrada and giant snakes in Constantinople. And then he sort of dropped at the end of the interview, said, "Oh, I've also written a book about Vikings in the West." And it was like, get that man on again, ladies and gentlemen, girls and boys, and those wearing, I was going to say helmets with pointy horns on them, but they never had those, in the corner. Delighted to say that Martyn joins us again. Martyn, good morning to you, sir.
Good morning. Thank you for having me back.
Pleasure's all mine. I couldn't resist. And I'm very excited because that looks like I can see your well-appointed library in the background because of the wonders of Zoom. And am I seeing some sort of parchment in the background there over your left shoulder? Is that some sort of Viking rune or something happening behind your shoulder?
Oh,
just there. Yeah.
That actually is a page from the Lindisfarne Gospels. But I have to assure listeners, it's not actually the Lindisfarne Gospels. It is simply a poster produced by the British Library. I didn't nip in, cut a bit out and stick it on my study. No, It is still safe and well in the British Library.
Come on, Martyn. We know that all that research of the Vikings has rubbed off on you. You know, osmosis. You've assimilated the berserker lust, and you went and you nicked the thing itself. Now, we talked about Vikings in the East, and I'd just been listening to a couple of podcasts on that very subject, which is why we were rattling away like good uns on this one. People will think of Vikings in the West, and presumably they'll be thinking about what is it, Eric the Red, basically. Is that? That's your bog standard one, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. In fact, one of the famous Vikings in our story is Leif Eric's son, right, who was the son of Eric the Red, who, according to saga evidence, and perhaps we could talk about that in a moment, the claim is that he is one of the first people to reach North America, having moved from Iceland to Greenland. It's this westward movement into North America. So Eric the Red is in the story, very much so, but particularly active is his son, Leif Eric's son, because of the North American connection, the Vinland connection. Of course, they never call it North America.
Sure, absolutely. Can we just talk about, because I suppose one of the problems that we have with the history of the Viking is saga, because they're not. Yes, and it's not a culture where things are naturally written down. So it is a form of storytelling, of saga, and that presents its own problems, and B, so that you got the story with the narrative, and also you got the story of the technology, because we just think about Vikings as longboat, i.e. thing with the dragon's head on the end of it, longboat, shields, the whole thing. The Viking culture, the Viking dynasties go for a very long time indeed, centuries in fact. So there has to be some, surely, technological advance. So by the time we're talking, what sort of time period are we're talking? And has it sort of evolved from what we think as the basic longboat to take on these huge distances?
Yeah, good questions. First of all, on the saga. Yeah. Sagas are very, very important, and there's lots of sagas to tell these dramatic stories of Norse history, Norse mythology, particularly focused on Iceland, because we know that particularly in Iceland in the 13th century, there was kind of an antiquarian movement to gather together all the oral traditions and maybe some written traditions and put them in a structured form. And so, for example, Snorri Sturluson is very famous for this in Iceland, others too. So we have a genre of writing called the sagas of various types: bishop sagas, king sagas, mythological sagas. But what they do is they try to bring together ancient traditions to explain who we are, they're saying, where did we come from, what are our stories. But they usually date from about the 13th century and a little bit later. So they're interesting because in one sense we start to see oral tradition written down, so they will contain amongst the mythological material and so on things that are a genuine oral history referring to things that almost certainly did happen, but there are also works of literature as well. So we always have to remember with the sagas, we're dealing with works of literature, but for those that purport to be historical sagas, we are undoubtedly also talking about real people, real events, but who have been worked with, crafted, if you like, by the saga writers. So we're not talking about works of fiction, but we're not talking about objective history as we would now know it today. But when they begin to concur, when they give a coherent account, when one begins to reinforce the other, and when they echo things that are said in other sources, we begin to realize that these people, these larger-than-life characters, these Leif Eriksons, these Eric the Reds, and so on and so forth, these are real people doing real things, albeit it's been crafted in a particular way. So sagas will be important in our story as long as we use them cautiously and critically. That brings us to your boats. Everybody is obsessed with the understandably from Hollywood and et cetera, the longboat, the dragon-proud ship. Now, what we should be thinking about is much more workaday vessels, broader in the beam, deeper in the draft, sometimes called Nors or Nars in Old Norse, which have a hold, which basically are there to battle their way through the North Atlantic, the Denmark Strait, and down into the Irish Sea. So although coastal craft will very often be for the elites, the warrior longboat, because that's a sign of your elite status, and they're very shallow drafted, so they can penetrate up rivers very, very far inland, shockingly so, for the people who are trying to resist them. In the North Atlantic, we need to put that to one side, and we're talking about much tougher workaday vessels, which are built for deep sea travel and the storms of the North Atlantic. So even though the North Atlantic is a little calmer in this time, because there's good evidence that, in fact, the ice packs further north, the storms are rather less around the year 1000. So there's a window of opportunity, actually, that shuts down at around sort of 1300, 1400, which allows Norse settlement of the North Atlantic. Nevertheless, these are still wild seas, stormy seas, but with much more workaday, sturdy boats, probably not a dragon prow in sight.
I'm glad you pointed that out to me, because I've always thought, hang on a second, so that we've got working vehicles that are more suited to travelling great ocean things rather than everybody getting, because you'd have frozen you would have frozen the horns off your helmet, not the head knee, if you're trying to cross from Iceland to there. Okay. So and it's interesting you say about that whole thing about the concurrent, the saga, the tale, and then the history, because we'll go back to our first interview. Harald Hardrada in Constantinople in a tower. There's something down there that's not very nice, but it's not a dragon. It's probably a very large snake or something, but it just gets turbocharged. So the migration, so it's from what we would call Iceland, that whole sort of Scandinavian block, and they're going westwards to Greenland, as we call it now, and presumably they're interacting with the Inuits, the native people there. What's the story, Marty?
Yes, absolutely so. So this is last time we talked about the eastward movement of the Vikings into the Baltic, into the Baltic, down the river systems. Now we're looking at the more familiar tale of the westward movement of the Vikings, into the North Sea, down the English Channel, down the Irish Sea, and so on. But of course, further north and further west as well. So we have a movement of people primarily from Norway, but also from Norse settlements in the British Isles. Ireland, for example, will feature, and in fact, female DNA turns up in very significant proportions in the modern Icelandic population from Ireland. So we know that a significant number of Irish women were part of this movement to Iceland in the 9th century. Now, whether they went there freely as wives, or whether they went there as concubines, whether they went there as slaves, it's now not possible to reconstruct. But we see a movement of people, particularly from Norway, but also from Ireland and from Norse settlements, the British Isles, to Iceland. We know, for example, from sealed deposits because of volcanic activity in Reykjavik, that they're there by about 870, and then within the generation and a half after that, so we're talking about by the middle of the 10th century, that there's a push onward, ever westward, often fueled by people being driven out in exile. They've done something wrong in Iceland, for example, they have to leave. They've done something wrong in Norway, they have to leave. So it's a combination of the attraction of, go west, young man and young woman, and seek your fortune, but also get out of town before you get yourself into deep deep trouble. And this leads to this incredible PR exercise, which talks about Greenland is the place to go to. Now, it was more attractive then. It wasn't as cold as it is today. It was greener than it is today. Nevertheless, it obviously is a PR pitch as well. Iceland's good, but come to Greenland, you can carve out a new frontier. So by the beginning of the 10th century, we're seeing this movement west again, and certainly by the 950s or so, we've got settlement on Greenland. So Iceland, Greenland, and then, of course, what happens next? And it's the movement west. But we need to see the movement west that will take us to North America as part of a push westward that has pull factors, the attractions of what is out there, and also push factors, the needing to get out of Dodge, as it were. You've got yourself into trouble, sheriff's come in, time to get out of Dodge. And that pushed a lot of people out of Iceland and Greenland as well. A mixed community.
Is there presumably trade, because you're saying, okay, there is the get out of town, because Viking politics are very interesting. And there tends to be generally after some drinking in a long haul and something happens and somebody has to get out the next day. But presumably there are trade links going here as well, because we tend to think one boat heading off and never seen again sort of thing, or establishing. But presumably there are I was going to say intercambious, but there's exchange, isn't there? Like there is, for example, when we talked about the eastern routes. So presumably we are going from Ireland, or we're going from what is now Norway to Iceland, trade going back that way, drop off point up to Greenland, and again trade coming back, and this is the way we're getting the information through.
Yeah, very much so. So this is part of an interconnection. We need to see these seaways not as barriers, but as motorways. Pretty wild and dangerous motorways, but nevertheless, they are the motorways of the time. So there is a lot of movement backwards and forwards between Scandinavia and the British Isles and Iceland, and then eventually to Greenland. And things are going in all directions. So the products of the north, for example, we're thinking about, walrus ivory. We're thinking about polar bear pelts. We're thinking about dried fish and so on. That's coming out of the north. And there are attractions, seabirds in large quantities, which can be taken. Their eggs can be taken. They can be taken and killed and preserved. So we're seeing seabirds, we're seeing eggs, we're seeing all the products of the north moving in the North Atlantic. And we're seeing movements of people as well. But these areas do have some drawbacks. And the drawbacks of Iceland and Greenland is that there's a shortage of wood. Yeah. So there is wood there. I mean, there's a modern joke that says if you get lost in an Icelandic forest and don't know where you are, it's okay, just stand up. Because nowadays they tend not to be of the size they were when Norse settlers arrived in the 870s. But there were never huge forests, but there were forests. But Iceland is very often denuded of its forests. There's very little tree cover, just stunted stuff in Greenland. So there is a desire. Can we find wood? And in fact, in the story of the movement to North America, what we pick up from the sagas is amongst the things that come back from North America and amongst wooden products that have been found on Greenland, for example, are trees that clearly did not get there by drift, but were actually cut down in North America and brought back. So one of the attractions of North America is timber, as well as other possible products as well. So we have to see movement going right across the North Atlantic that's about adventure, but it's also about workaday. What do we need? What's the products we're after? What have we got to buy and sell? And then that means you trade with native peoples as well, First Nations people, Native Americans in North America, Proto-Inuits, and people who are moving south through Greenland are interacting with the Norse. And we know this from some of the evidence, which perhaps talk about in a moment, that there is a lot of interaction going on between the Norse and Proto-Inuit groups, people who today will be the Inuit peoples of the Canadian Arctic, Canadian subarctic, and of Greenland, for example. A lot of interaction going on.
Must have been a very interesting interaction between these two groups, because they're both. I mean, you think the Vikings are hard. Come and meet the Inuit. I think come and meet the First Nation people, because they really are quite something.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to paint the scene, the two sagas that connect us with North America are two sagas, because out of that will come the connections with Native Americans and other peoples. Is Eric the Red's saga and the saga of the Greenlanders. So these are compiled in Iceland from information that's gathered from across the wider Norse world. And the earliest surviving manuscripts from them date from shortly after 1264 for Eric the Red saga and 1387 for the saga of the Greenlanders. And so these are the key sagas in this story. And however they disagree over details, roles of individuals, sometimes the ordering of events, what they never disagree about is a central claim that Viking settlers moved from Iceland to Greenland, and from there to a land they describe as Vinland. And this is where the story really takes off, because the question is, what is this Vinland? Where is this Vinland that is to the west of Greenland, which is found, some accounts say by accident, it's seen by accident, but people don't land there. They come back and say, we've seen something strange. Others then go deliberately to find it, but they all insist that at about the year 1000, they don't date it in those terms, but from the characters who are involved, around the year 1000, groups of settlers, adventurers, pioneers from Greenland end up in a land or series of different islands and a mainland to the west of Greenland, which they call Vinland. And along the way, they put in at places they describe as Helluland, which means stone slab land in Norse, Markland, which means forest land. Remember the forest products and the need for wood, and eventually Vinland. Because of the topography that's described in the sagas, and they're pretty good stuff. So this is why I say we have to talk about, this is a mix of literature, but also of reality. We're pretty sure that Helluland was the east coast of Baffin Island in the Canadian territory of Nunavut, and it may have included the mountainous regions of northern Labrador, both are tundra ecozones. Markland, named from the Norse word for forest, almost certainly refers to the southern coast of Labrador. So there are enough geographical clues within these places to think we're not dealing with a never land. We are dealing with real places. And Vinland, and this is the real question, Vinland probably refers to the area from the Gulf of St. Lawrence to northern New England in what is now the United States, because the sagas insist that wild grapes and wild wheat were located there. And by thinking about the growing range of wild grapes, possibly the fox grape, and wild wheat, we end up with a location no further north than New Brunswick, and Maine is a real candidate too, and possibly further south to Cape Cod, although Newfoundland will come into the story in a moment, very, very importantly. But these clues suggest that people that went from Greenland hopped across the Canadian Arctic and subarctic, hit the mainland, moved south, possibly as far south as Maine, and it could have been as far south as Cape Cod. Certainly, they reached the area around the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and almost certainly they must have gone lower down as well, further south as well, on the east coast of the US, of what's now Canada and the USA.
Vikings in Maine, mind officially blown there. But it makes sense, vines and obviously the wild wheat, which must have been, I mean, you would be getting onto the stuff of legend, wouldn't you, though, the stuff of fantasy? Because if you've come from, volcanic tundra, Greenland, Baffin Island, and then you get to there, that's going to seem like, that's one sort of hop from Valhalla. So, Newfoundland. Now, is the clue in the name there, or are we just anglicising it?
Okay, now Newfoundland actually takes its name from a later period of European settlement, but Newfoundland is key because the sagas are just that. They are the sagas. What do we make of them? Come the 20th century, and perhaps in a moment we'll look at how others ran with this in America before the modern discoveries. But from the 20th century, we now know there were Norse on Newfoundland around the year 1000. A place called Launceston Meadows, which means Bay of the Jellyfish, located at the northern tip of Newfoundland's Great Northern Peninsula. After examination in the 1930s, several archaeological investigations have occurred there. With modern scientific techniques, it's now looked after by Parks Canada. And what we found there are four building complexes, two of them with a large hall, a small hall beside it, a third complex made up of a large hall, a small hut, and a small house, possibly talking about different classes there, maybe thralls, slaves, as well as the elites. In addition to these buildings, we assume to accommodate people, a fourth complex down closer to the sea, which included an iron smelting hut. The construction style and a limited number of artifacts indicate the site was Norse and not Native American First Nations. We have evidence for trees cut down using metal-style axes, which we've dated now to about 1021, which were not available for First Nations, Native American people at the time, and also finds of wood and butternuts or white walnuts, which suggest they sailed further south into basically further south on the Canadian eastern border and the USA. But what's really intriguing is this, that in 2021, dendrochronological evidence was published from Launceston Meadow, which shows that the trees there were cut down in 1021. So it's absolutely quite extraordinary that in 2021, the scientific data finally emerged that these trees were cut down by Europeans and used for construction in 1021. So basically, we now know from archaeological evidence that Northern Europeans, clearly Norse, from Greenland, because there's comparable artifact culture there, were on Newfoundland in 1021. And that is American Vikings definitely there. We'll come on to runestones and invented Vikings perhaps in a moment, but they were definitely there. And what's also been interesting is that although the archaeological evidence is very thin, so it's like, well, how long were they there for? We seem not very much, not for very long, because there's no depth of the archaeology, as it were. In 2018, some more research was published, which used something called Bayesian statistical modeling applied to the legacy radiocarbon dating from the site. Yeah. And that suggested that something was going on there for at least a century after 1021. So how do we make sense of this? Thin archaeology, not a lot of evidence, which suggests a short period there, but evidence that now shows, but people were active there, Europeans, for a century. What's almost certainly the case is that there was not a continuous Viking occupation in Newfoundland. That seems unlikely. It indicates the possibility of occasional Norse activity there beyond the early 11th century, as they put in there as a staging post to move further westward. Right. So we need to see the Newfoundland site as a staging post between Greenland and movement further west, which takes us into the North American continent.
Because if you look at what happens along going east, it's the same situation. Yep. The Viking it's not a huge swathe of territory. They're not interested in that. They just want staging posts all the way along. So that fits into the narrative absolutely perfectly, Martyn.
Yeah, and there's also some literary evidence to support it as well, because the Annals of the Kings of Iceland record in 1121, Bishop Eric from Greenland went to look for Vinland. This reference was part of a much later source compiled between about 1300 and 1328. But it makes you think, that's intriguing. It's referring to something that happened 200 or 300 years before, but Eric from Greenland to Vinland. What's going on there? The Lawman's Annals, also from Iceland, mention Eric leaving Iceland in 1121 with the enigmatic words, Voyage of Bishop Eric. This was written sometime after 1412. But again, we have this literary evidence. And in this case, it's from more documentary sources rather than literary sources. These aren't sagas, saying there was an ecclesiastical movement from Iceland to Greenland to Vinland, this adventurous explorer, Bishop Eric. So there clearly was movements towards Vinland in the century after the saga refers to it. Similarly, the Elder Skalholt Annals, also from Iceland, compiled about 1362, record as late as 1347, there came also a ship from Greenland. It was without an anchor. There were 70 men on board, and they had sailed to Markland. Remember, that's one of the staging points to Vinland. Yep. And afterwards had been driven by storms at sea. So in 1347, we have a group of Norse who make it back to Iceland thinking, wow, I've made it. Gosh, I lost my anchor. I thought I was lost. But when people talk to them, where were you on your way from and to? They say, we'd been to Markland. In other words, we'd been on the journey to Vinland as late as the middle of the 14th century. Quite extraordinary. And about this time, we also see that Helluland, again, remember that's one of the staging points of Vinland, starts to appear in mythical sagas as well, where history mixes with mythology. And we've got one called the Saga of Halfdan Eystein's son, dates from sometime after 1350, and it contains an enigmatic statement that says, a ruler named Ragnar brought Helluland's deserts under his sway and destroyed all the giants there. Now, that clearly is a mythological statement, but it shows that this Wild West frontier is very much a living tradition, including people going there and coming back until the middle of the 14th century, well into the medieval period. And then we hear no more because the beginning of the Little Ice Age that is starting by about 1400 will snuff out Norse settlement on Greenland and will cause a southward movement of pack ice, an increased series of storms, and the connection with the far west is lost. But it continues from the year 1000 for at least 350 years. 350 years of movement westward to North America before it comes to an end around 1400. And this, of course, is a century or more before Columbus discovers, well, not even mainland America, but Caribbean islands in 1492.
Martyn, mind officially blown. Thank you so much. That is incredible stuff. We've only got less than a minute and a half left, and I knew this was going to be good. If people want to find out more information about Helluland or giants being slain or anything more about that from your dear self, where is the best place to find you online?
Well, they can find the book, which is called American Vikings, How the Norse Sailed into the Lands and Imaginations of America, published by Pegasus Books New York 2023 and distributed by Simon & Schuster. Can be found online or wherever books are sold. But it also tells the story, as its strapline explains, how they've sailed into the minds and imaginations of America. You'll find Americans in the 19th century discovering, I suggest, manufacturing runestones. You will find them taken up by the American comic book culture of the 1950s and 60s. Cool. You will find them amongst the alt-right, and you'll find symbols at the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, 2017, and at the Capitol building on 6th of January, 2021. So the book looks at how they got there and how they've entered into the imaginations of America in the 1,000 years since.
I feel a third interview coming on about Norse mythology and the alt-right, but in the meantime, Martyn, once again, it's been an absolute pleasure. Listeners, you can also hopefully order the book via our own virtual bookstore. But Martyn Whittock, I thought it was going to be good. It was better than I can ever imagine. Have a great rest of your day.